Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park here in beautiful San Francisco. Thank you to everyone tuning in online from wherever you are tuning in from. We are in San Francisco this evening, and tonight we are here with Alina Adams and Masha Rumer celebrating their most recent books, My Mother's Secret and Parenting with an Accent. Let's give a hand for each of them. Thank you so kindly. Well, very brief business. Please do check out our full event calendar on our website at greenapplebooks.com. And thank you also, if you already have, for purchasing books by each of our authors at the front of the store. We have plenty available for each of their books, and I think they would be happy to sign them at the end of the evening. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the authors that are joining us tonight, and once we get started, we'll have a discussion between Alina and Masha, and we'll have an audience Q&A at the end where you can ask any question you would like, well, within reason. So without further ado, first, Alina Adams is the New York Times best-selling author of soap opera tie-in, figure skating mysteries, and romance novels. Alina was born in Odessa, USSR, and immigrated to San Francisco with her family in 1977. Her historical fiction novels, The Nesting Doll and My Mother's Secret, a novel of the Jewish Autonomous Region, were both inspired by Alina's Soviet background and her immigration experience. You can find more about her at alinaadams.com. Let's give another hand for her. Thank you so much. And Masha Rumer is an award-winning journalist and freelance writer. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Quartz, the Moscow Times, Parents.com, SF Weekly, Volume 1 Brooklyn, and many other places. An immigrant from the former Soviet Union, she now lives with her family in California, where she is navigating the nuances of multicultural and interfaith parenting. You can find her online at masharumer.com or on Twitter at MashaDC. Please give a hand for Masha Rumer.
So we decided we're not going to read tonight because we actually have so many questions that we want to ask each other that we hope that you'll find entertaining, so we're going to just jump right into that. And so I'm going to start because I have the mic. Masha, I loved your book. I've been telling everyone you need to buy Parenting with an Accent because almost everyone that I know is either an immigrant parent or an immigrant child, and very often both. So I just want to start with the very basics of what made you think that this should be a book. I realize that sounds kind of aggressive, but what made you think to write a book like this? Because there really isn't a lot of research on the topic.
Thank you so much, Alina. And I will get back to you because I have my list of questions. So not aggressive at all. I think the more aggressive questions would be like, where are you from? No, where are you really from? Or
Masha, that's an interesting name. What does it mean?
Yeah, what does it mean? Are you sure? Is it with an R? No, it's not. Really? Are you planning to go back? Because your government is like, it's really bad. Like I know. That's why I'm here. By the way, do we know where that camera is like going?
Yes, we did. It's kind of.
It's like not going to like the Kremlin or anything.
She didn't.
We'll talk about that too.
Card didn't say it wasn't.
No. Well, we'll just. We'll assume it's not going anywhere that's supposed to. Okay, so yes, basically I decided that the book needs to be written because I wish there was something like this when I first had kids. Actually, I have two. My daughter is 9 and my son is 7. Which sounds crazy because they were just babies.
Mine are 23, 19, and 16, and they were just babies.
Wow. Yeah, you never stop marveling about that. So I have lived in the United States most of my life. Actually, I think like you, Alina, immigrated straight to the Bay Area, right? Did you?
Came to? Yes, we came straight to San Francisco.
Okay, I was in the South Bay, but don't hold that against me. That's why I was a little late because there was traffic, and people really want to live in San Jose. It's really cool. Trust me. So I lived here most of my life. My partner is American, born and bred, so we got along. We spoke English, obviously, together. But when my daughter was born, suddenly I realized that something was really missing, and there was this flood of emotions and memories and experiences of my own childhood and my upbringing, which I was, of course, disconnected from because I immigrated. I was a refugee. The countries I knew no longer existed, which is a good thing. The city where I was born was renamed, and I had very few ties back there, even though I still have a lot of family in various parts of the former Soviet Union. And I felt like I needed to connect, but I didn't know how. I felt like I was failing in addition to the regular mom guilt. I felt that there was the guilt of not, always thinking that my cousins are like better at raising their kids to be bilingual than me. They're doing more traditional dances than mine are doing. At the same time, I was really worried, what if my kids don't know like all the latest books and TV shows? And of course, in the United States. And of course, there was the issue of language too. How do I pass on my language without forcing it if they're starting to refuse it? And they start refusing the language, not just in my case, but pretty much for any language. Very often, it's an immigrant experience. And of course, there was a social aspect too. How do I relate to other parents who have vastly different experiences than I do? Maybe we live in the same zip code. Maybe we have kids who are born in the same hospital. Maybe our babies are all colicky at the same time, but that's not enough. There's this deeper connection that I was yearning, and I felt like there was some kind of a barrier that I suddenly could not break through. So I started digging in, I started listening, and I saw a lot of people, no matter where they were from, had the same questions. And a lot of them actually weren't able to even discuss them because either they had no words or there was just a lot of trauma and pain connected to it. And I realized it needs to be written about. So I started publishing articles little by little. And then realized that there needs to be a book. And once I realized I wanted to write a book, I was very strategic about it. I took a course on writing a proposal for a nonfiction book. Actually, my husband sent me to write the proposal. I had a different book in mind at that time, but I came back home from that course in writing a book proposal. That same week, I already had my chapters lined up, and I started looking for an agent. And after 4 years, there is the book, Parenting the Next. Long answer.
Well, I actually want to ask you something, because language is just a small piece of culture and everything that comes with it. I'm particularly thinking of a section in your book where you talk about parents who took their kids to a ballroom dancing class specifically because they wanted it to be in Russian. But it wasn't just the Russian they wanted that discipline and other things. So, in fact, for instance, they thought that the teacher, even though she might be Russian speaking, was too American. And then what was the line? Oh, you jumped, you turned around, good for you. Instead of being, I am Russian dance teacher, that is bad. So my question to you is, it's not just language. Language leads you to something else. Language leads you to culture. So can you speak a little bit about how language isn't just words?
That's so funny that you bring that passage up, Alina, because if we were to read it, I actually was going to read that very passage tonight. That's hilarious. But yes, it's not just the language. It's everything that's connected to it. For example, like that experience of wanting to expose my kids to the language I grew up with. It's the dishes, it's the jokes. And I mean, coming from Odessa, the jokes are such a huge part of the cultural milieu. And it was very difficult. And of course, the relationships with their ancestors and even my own parents, who obviously are fluent in English, but they feel a lot easier, a lot more relaxed and like themselves authentic, I would say, if they communicate in Russian. But it's also the classes, the class that you're describing. I went to a class in Berkeley for ballroom dancing. My daughter at that time was already taking classes at an American ballet class, and it was pretty serious by American standards, which means if you went on Yelp, everybody there would say, oh, this teacher is so harsh, she's so mean. She said, my daughter is not like doing this in the most flexible way possible, she needs to practice more. How dare she do that? And I was like, yes, I'm going to go to that studio. But I tried the Russian language one too, and I think it's something that on the one hand, I think a lot of us, we despise this authoritarian parenting approach that we grew up with, that, you never question, the government, you never question your parents, you just kind of...
But every once in a while I go, wouldn't it be nice if just once every parental edict was not debated and as if it were a bill?
And if we were just listened to without being... I'm questioned by 2 people, you're questioned by 3. That's looks like a lot more, too, like kids. But, excuse me, not sick, it's just in my throat. So it's finally we found the studio when the teacher was actually speaking in Russian, and when she tried to speak to the kids didn't understand because they were kids of immigrants and they communicated in English. And suddenly we were listening by the door, like, what is she speaking? She's speaking English? Oh my God.
This is not why I came to
This
Berkeley.
is not what I came here for. And so suddenly somebody knocked on the door and said, excuse me, why do you speak English to my children? I can do this myself. And she was like, well, because they don't really understand Russian. And if they don't get it, I can't teach them the moves. And then like all the other parents were like, well, you must try. You must try to teach them in Russian. So not only do you have to be strict and very, authoritarian, but you also have to speak the language. So she went back in and started speaking Russian to them, and it all worked out.
Well, I like to say that I screwed up in getting my children to speak Russian. I have 3 different children, and I screwed up in 3 different ways. In that, with my older son, he did have a Russian-speaking nanny when he was very young, so his receptive was pretty good, even though his speech, everything was in the present tense and everything was masculine, but at least he had some understanding of it. My second son is basically if you want him to do something, then it becomes his goal in life to do the exact opposite. So you spoke Russian to him, and he would just tune out. For some reason, the only words he would accept were "morozheno" and "polotенце." I don't know why those 2 particular ones. At one point, "pelmeni" was added to the list, but that was it. And then my daughter, because she does rhythmic gymnastics, where even though her particular coach is not Russian speaking, everyone around her is Russian speaking, so she was able to pick up some of that. But then my older son decided to go to Moldova. He lived in Moldova for 10 months as part of a U.S. scholarship program where I called it the Junior Spies of America. I was like, no, it's not a spy program. It's for the study of...
To the camera, not a spy.
Not a spy, not a spy. But it's for the study of vital languages. What languages do they learn? Russian, Korean, Farsi, Arabic. Vital for what? So he did that for 10 months, and now his Russian is actually better than mine in the sense. Well, my mother says he speaks with a Georgian accent. He sounds like Stalin, but his but his grammar, because he actually studied grammar. He actually studied it, and sometimes he'll ask me, why are you conjugating this word like this? And my response is, I don't know. It just sounds right. So eventually, even though I failed with all 3 kids in 3 different ways to get them to speak, but you touched this in your book as well. Some people say, well, it has to be that because my husband's American as well and he doesn't speak Russian. So one parent, you have to speak to them only in Russian or Korean or Farsi or any vital language of your choice. You have to speak to them because once they figure out that you understand English, the jig is up.
That's it. Yep.
The jig is up. But I don't know about how you felt about this, but for me, I felt rude speaking to my children in Russian while my husband was in the room. It's a very awkward dynamic, so I never did it. But one of them at least came around to wanting to learn Russian on his own. The other 2, I'm still not sure.
First of all, I think it's amazing that your son went to Moldova and spent almost a year and he learned the grammar, because I think a lot of us immigrants who came when they were little, and you were little.
Yeah, I'm 7.
Yeah, we haven't actually learned that formally, but so kudos to you. That's really great. But that's one of the things that I found that I was kind of actually very difficult to process, is the fact that there are these rules on how to raise a bilingual child. You must always speak in this language, and then if you don't, then that's it. But it's a very hard rule to follow. We're not around all the time. Sometimes the other parent is with the kid more. And let's face it, if you're saying say something I don't know.
Morozheno, polotенце, pelmeni.
Morozheno, which is ice cream, for those of you who are not sure. Morozheno, and they're like ice cream. Although, no, that would say it in Russian because they would want to get that. So they know.
Yeah, we were pretty sure we understood why morozheno and why pelmeni, why polotенце, which means towel. We're not really sure about that.
Polotенце, say polotенце, they'd be like towel, polotенце, towel. And then you're like, I could either argue till I'm blue in the face, or I can just speak English to the kid just to have this connection and interaction. And that's what a lot of people end up doing. A lot of parents end up doing. So this very strict, all or nothing approach is very limiting, and it's very psychologically damaging, I feel, to parents and to kids too. And I don't want to talk about language this whole time, even though it's fascinating. But there are many other ways. There's at least 3 other ways of being, bilingual, or raising a bilingual child. Even if you mix languages, like code switching, it's not necessarily as likely to yield this perfect bilingual child. But neither is perfect, one parent, one language approach either. There are studies that even in the south of Florida, one parent speaks Spanish, or they speak Spanish in the home the whole time. At school it's English, and as soon as the kids go to school, the language starts to atrophy, the Spanish language. There are many cases like that in research. So no matter how we try, it's not necessarily going to yield success. But if you're more relaxed about it, maybe you start later, or maybe you let it go and they pick it up again when they're older, like when they go to Moldova or something
Like
else.
when they're recruited for the junior spies.
Or when they're recruited for the junior, what is it, like from The Simpsons, FBI, like Flowers by Irene van was parked there. So yeah, there's always a way to teach another language and to pick up another language, even later in life. And a lot of times it actually happens in young adulthood, even if the child might refuse or might not have all the tools to pick it up right away. But language mixing or reverting to English is totally okay too, and maybe it's a little bit more complicated, but it still works.
Well, let me ask you this. You obviously didn't just look at your own experience with your own two children when you're writing this book. What kind of research did you, because you spoke to academics, you went to visit schools, you spoke to other parents. What kind of research did you do? Since, in a sense, kind of every parent's experience is their own personal experience and every family has their own dynamics. So how do you generalize from that?
That's a really good question. Thank you. Yeah, I spoke to more than 60 people in the writing of this book, and it wasn't just language related. There was psychologists, there were sociologists, but the vast majority were immigrants or the children of immigrants who might not have been parents themselves, since it's not just a book about parenting or for parents. And I spoke to a few professors or practicing speech language pathologists at Columbia University Teachers College, who actually is famous because she used to be an accent coach for Elmo on Sesame Street. And she's a professor of speech and language pathology, and also I spoke to a few more in Florida, and actually I also spoke to Professor Ellen Bialystok, who actually came up with a theory that that bilingual kids are better at multitasking and cognitive functions, executive function when they're little, if they speak two or more languages. And in fact, bilingual people, when they're older, they can stave off the diagnosis of dementia by 4 to 5 years too. So I interviewed her a couple of times. But it wasn't that I was just sitting there looking at research, which of course was a lot of it. I basically went to see where language is actually spoken. Because language is not just something that you pick up, as many of you probably know, and like read or like watch on TV or talk to this like app, right? It's this living, breathing thing that changes and evolves. So I went to a church, an Ethiopian church outside of New York City. I went to homes and like saw how kids play piano and talk to their teacher at the same time, and how the teacher is like reprimanding them in Russian and they respond in English. I also spoke to somebody at an Arabic cultural center in San Francisco as well, where language is just a part of this greater activity and just a greater life experience. Maybe it's art classes, maybe it's play dates, maybe it's just some kind of a thing that's, that they're creating when they're playing together. But it's so much more than just instruction. It's part of our life, and it continues to evolve, just like our understanding of, just like, I guess, the way we speak our own language is the way kids learn it's a very dynamic process, and it's everywhere around us.
So the other question that I think it applies to both of us, I'll ask you and I'll ask me, is the fact that you're writing not in your first language, not in your native language. Now for me, it's clearly much easier to speak English and to read and write English, but I was younger when I came. I was 7. I mean, I spoke Russian and I wrote Russian and I read Russian, but then I switched over to English. You were older. So what's it like writing in a language that isn't your mother tongue, for lack of a better term?
It's a lot. I'm a lot more comfortable reading and writing in English. I mean, I read in Russian too, of course, fluently, but writing to me is not, doesn't come to me as easily. Actually, I didn't even know how to type. For my master's thesis, I had it was in comparative literature, so I had to compare literatures. So I had some Russian passages from Russian literature, and actually ended up like doing symbols, like copy and paste the words. But I actually learned to type in Russian when I was looking for a babysitter for my kids, and I had to make sure that it's somebody who spoke Russian, which meant they probably didn't speak English. So I learned, and now
I had my mother do it.
Oh.
No, I wanted the exact same thing. I wanted a Russian-speaking babysitter, but I couldn't even place the ad. I had to have my mother do it.
Oh, the network is strong. Yeah.
So for me, it is a bit easier to write in English because I said it was but I'm in a situation of, so I'm writing a book that's set in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and I'm writing it in English, but sometimes I'll have a Russian word in it. And then, so here's where it gets really complicated. So when the characters are speaking Russian, they would be speaking flawlessly. So I write in correct English. But when the characters are speaking English, because there's actually the framing section of the book takes place in San Francisco in the 1980s, which is kind of my era, the characters are obviously speaking Russian with a Russian accent. So in a part of the book, the same character is speaking English, but I use Russian phraseology, I use Russian structure, I'll remove a few articles to make it sound like someone is speaking with a Russian accent. But then in the main section of the book, when they're in the Soviet Union and they're speaking Russian, they're speaking perfect English. It gets very confusing.
I loved how you did that that language, like how you conveyed the Russian speech in English. So it takes it doesn't come naturally. You have to like do all this translation back and forth.
Well, I have to get into that headspace, and then I have to start thinking with a Russian accent, which I can do relatively easily. I've had a lot of lives, and in my past life, I worked for ABC Sports in their figure skating coverage department. And so here's one thing we did. So we went to Moscow in 1996 to film interviews with various skaters who were going to participate in the 1997 World Championships and the 1998 Olympics. And so I was the translator for all of them. I would sit and I would ask them the questions in Russian. They would answer in Russian. I would translate it, and so on. But then when they actually put the footage on ABC Sports, because familiar with ABC Sports, they have the up close and personal and all of that. So I'm the voice that's dubbing in English what the skater is saying in Russian, but they want me to say it with a Russian accent. So when I translated for both Irina Slutskaya, who was a skater, and her mother. So it was decided that when I spoke for Irina Slutskaya, I would have a slight Russian accent, and when I spoke for her mother, I would have a heavier Russian accent, because that's how Americans thought other Americans wanted to see Russian speaking translated into English.
It's this othering, right? The bad guy, like the immigrant. Yeah,
they're saying moose and squirrel. That's basically, they want that accent. They want the Bullwinkle accent.
Moose and squirrel, right?
Well, let me ask you actually this: do people ever get suspicious why you don't have an accent? Because people ask me, well, if you are born in the Soviet Union, why don't you have an accent? It's like, what are you hiding?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, just even the concept of passing, like when people don't think you know it, but you actually do speak it, like language, and then they've just been saying things that they wish you never.
This actually happens. So my daughter, as I said, she does rhythmic gymnastics. She does rhythmic gymnastics with an African-American rhythmic gymnastics club. My husband's African-American, my daughter's African-American. And shockingly enough, when she goes to competitions, all the Russian coaches and the Russian athletes can't imagine that she could possibly understand what they're saying. So my daughter is standing right there, and all the Russian coaches are saying exactly what you think they're saying. And my daughter can understand them. So to talk about passing, that's a superpower. I mean, did you try selling that to your kids?
I did, and actually, and going back to bilingualism, I feel like we have all these threads that I want to go back to, but there was actually somebody that I spoke to when I did a talk in this past summer with a son who whose mother spoke Russian. And by the way, the book features not just Russian people, but they speak like 18 other languages other than English. The son was not really keen on speaking his mother's language, but when he went to college and started having this roommate that he wasn't too crazy about, he started picking up Russian, and he was like only speaking Russian on the phone with his mom and with his dad. He also knew some Russian. So maybe it just takes that kind of a, not a spy activity to kind of have it come back. I feel like there was something that I was going to ask you, or you asked me about languages, or before we...
Well, we were saying whether people were suspicious why you didn't have an accent. Although I will say, my honest answer is, it's not that I don't have an accent, it's I know what words I can't say, and so I dance around them. Like any word... you're going to test me now. Okay, any word where a V and a W come too close together, and if it sneaks up on me, then my kids make fun of me. But so you guys are going to watch how hard I'm going to have to concentrate to say this sentence. That's why I never wave at Volkswagens. But that's how much effort it takes me to say that. If it sneaks up on me, like if I'm reading something or if I'm speaking very quickly, it comes out as vague. And vague,
That's a
which
tough
my
one.
children find very amusing.
That's a tough one. Or I think the ooh sounds are like that for me as well.
Well, for me, it's the V and the W. It's just anytime I have a W too close to the V, they both turn into V's.
Well, as long as we understood, and I guess maybe the ABC would have been happy with that. But but I think you probably get that too. People say, well, if you're from somewhere else, where is your accent? I sometimes, I've had times when I had to make more of an accent just to, I don't know, I actually don't remember those specific instances, but at other times, I've actually had somebody tell me, oh, if you had an accent, people would understand why you act strange sometimes. I was like, well, thank you.
Oh,
very
is that
much.
my excuse?
Okay, well, right, I guess that is a superpower of sorts. I guess I wanted to ask you, if just to kind of change the direction a little bit, I want to make sure we have enough time to discuss your new book. And I hope most of you have had a chance to read it, and if not, it's available for sale.
It's on sale right at the counter.
Right
over
there. It's an amazing book. It's called My Mother's Secret, which is your newest historical novel. By the way, my mother is currently reading it and loving it, and she really loved your previous historical novel, The Nesting Dolls. And actually, when we met, because I happened to see it on Twitter at the beginning of the pandemic, and I visited your Zoom launch, which was amazing, and my daughter was there too. So she's also your fan. But it's both of the books by Alina are approved by my mother, but they're just really brilliant, aside from my mom. So without giving too much away, your latest novel takes place in Birobidzhan, which is part of the center of the first Jewish state established under Stalin, which is a really weird concept. And also during World War II, although it's not a World War II book.
It's not. It actually takes place in the 1930s, leading up to. There's parts of World War II in it. I mean, we do have the Battle of Moscow is a part of it, but Birobidzhan is the crux of it, because ever since I started doing book talks for my previous historical fiction, which was called The Nesting Dolls, which was about 3 generations of women, takes place in 1930s Odessa, USSR, 1970s Odessa, USSR, and present-day Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, which is a very heavily Russian-speaking community. And by the way, if anybody ever asks you, would you like to launch a book in a pandemic? Go,
No.
But
No.
July 2020 is when it was scheduled to come out. And that's when it came out. But I did start doing a lot of Zoom talks, and I did the launch. And at the end of it, I would ask people, what was the first independent Jewish state of the 20th century? And I mean, most people would understand it sounded like a trick question to them, so they would hold off. But people would say Israel. And the fact is, it was not. Israel was established in 1948, and 25 years before that, in 1923, as you said, Joseph Stalin, that great friend of the Jews, established a Jewish independent state on the border between Russia and China. It was an area, it's Siberia, but it's more southern part of Siberia, so it's not as frozen as you think of Siberia. It's more of a wet Siberia.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? Okay, so they have a 10-month rainy season. They have very little farmable land. They have very little land that you can send cattle and goats on because they don't have a lot of grass. The population is mostly native ethnic Korean and ethnic Chinese, and there's poppy fields. And the poppy fields are obviously part of the drug trade. So you periodically have they weren't called drug lords in the 1920s, but they were basically gangsters coming over from the Chinese side onto the Russian side to make sure that nobody was touching their poppy fields. And so we're still going into what could go wrong. There's bugs everywhere, so they constantly have to burn fires to keep the bugs away. So everything's covered in a fine layer of soot. And the people that they send to work there, and by send, actually, these volunteers, they're actually people who wanted to go build the first Jewish autonomous state, because you have to remember 3 things. First of all, with the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Revolution, all anti-Semitism was outlawed. But strangely, they found out that outlawing anti-Semitism didn't really stop anti-Semitism. So they needed another plan. And the plan was, maybe people would be less anti-Semitic if the Jews were somewhere else. If we got them out of their face, then they wouldn't be so anti-Semitic. So let's move them all into one area. Also, Zionism is illegal, which means that, and the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine is a non-starter. And Stalin, again, really wanted to, as he said, see, here's the problem with Jews, according to Stalin. Jews love money too much. And if you were to separate Jews from being moneylenders and store owners and sent them back to the land and made them good, hardworking peasants, they would be good people. And who can do that better than the Soviet Union? So we're going to move all these people, which brings me to the fact that you moved all these people with no farming experience. Most of the volunteers, and get this, it wasn't just people from the Soviet Union who went there. It was people from Western Europe. It was people from South America. It was people from North America. American Jews picked up, left the United States, and moved to that area with no farming experience whatsoever, but they'd read books about it.
That's amazing. And that's something I had no idea about before reading your book. I was like, did I just read that from Argentina? From the United States?
And you had to pay. You had to pay like the equivalent of $2,000 in order to be able to move to Birabajan. So people sold everything and they moved there and there was nothing there. So they come there and it's just barren land. People were literally living in holes in the ground. Then eventually they built some barracks. So the first year, 2/3 of the people who came left 6 months later. Those who didn't die. So because from exposure and everything else. So after that they made it illegal to leave because, you know, it's such a wonderful place. Why would you allow people to leave it? And so you have people who are living there who really think they are building the only Jewish homeland that they're ever going to get. That's what was so fascinating to me, that this was a piece of history. And I've spoken to people who thought they knew history, who certainly thought they knew Jewish history, and they had no idea that this place existed. And here's the kicker. It still officially exists. It was never changed. The paperwork, you know, it's not like they ever made it not the Jewish Autonomous Region. So if you go down the rabbit hole that is YouTube, which is especially something that you do when it's a pandemic and you're sitting at home and it's just you and YouTube, there's documentaries. First there's historical footage of people arriving. Then there's propaganda footage of urging people, it was like propaganda movies to get people to immigrate. And it was showing how happy everyone was. Everyone was happy. The peasants were happy, the cattle were happy, the fish were practically jumping out of the water into their nets. They were so happy to be in Birabajan. So you have the propaganda films, but then you have modern films, and that's so interesting. So now the area is only 1% Jewish. It's mostly ethnic Korean and Chinese. So, but the street signs, you can still see the street signs that are written in Yiddish, and you can see some of the storefronts still have Yiddish signs. And the funniest part is, so you have these ethnic Korean and Chinese children singing little songs in Yiddish because they're learning about the history of their town. And the history of their town is that it's the Jewish Autonomous Region. So you have these kids, they're singing these Yiddish songs.
It's very difficult for me to comprehend. My father once visited for like a day because he was building one of the railroads, the Baikal-Amur Railroad.
It's the last stop. It's the last stop on the Trans-Siberian Railroad.
Okay, so, but yeah, he didn't really find, it was a long time ago, but he didn't really find a lot of Jewish presence. I did read an interview with Terry Gross of Masha Gessen.
Mm-hmm.
And
Masha Gessen has a wonderful nonfiction book called Where the Jews Aren't.
And she mentioned that she couldn't even find Jewish food there when she went to visit, and she found finally like a piece of schnitzel that was made from pork. So my question to you is, first of all, have you been to Birabajan yourself yet, or not yet?
No, I have not. When we're back to pandemic, I have been nowhere.
Okay, I understand, right? The YouTube traveling, for sure. What I want to know is, you describe Birabajan, and then obviously, you know, with the World War II scenes, and then hope I'm not giving too much away. Prison camp, with such, like, so vividly. There are so many details. You describe what, like, moldy clothes smell like when they're stashed away in a room that the workers can't wear because they have nowhere to go because they're just working all the time. You describe what it's like to, like, pick rye with your bare hands, or like slap these bugs from you when they're like attacking you. And you talk about the prison camp and the hospital room in the prison camp, which is just horrid. But it's so visual, and you feel like you're there. I mean, you're a master storyteller. I mean, I always knew that, but how were you able to convey all those details so vividly? Obviously, having not lived through those times, thank goodness, but how did you do that?
I made things up.
Well, it's brilliant.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, that I made things up after a lot of historical research. That's the whole thing. As I said, I looked at primary sources like propaganda movies that were made in the time period. Swarthmore University has actually a wonderful archive of propaganda posters that were made to tour the United States. That Chagall did a poster for them. It was a very, very popular movement to urge people to come. And there was even a plane that they took from city to city telling people, come to Birabajan, it's great. So I did that. I definitely looked at the primary sources. I also looked at documentaries that were made after the fact that incorporated historical footage. But I'll tell you about the prison camp scene because this is something that was very moving to me. There's a channel called Decades, which is a fabulous channel for someone who's obsessed with the past like I am and looking at primary sources. And it was a story that Charles Kuralt did about how Charles Kuralt was in Moscow in 1988 for the summit, the Gorbachev-Reagan summit. And he said this elderly man came up to him, and he was trying to talk to everyone who speaks English until he found Charles Kuralt, who's a reporter, and he said, I have to tell you a story. And this man said, during World War II, I was in a prison camp. Said I was on there was a Soviet side and there was an American side because the Soviets were not signatories to the Geneva Convention, and because they were not signatories to the Geneva Convention, the Soviet soldiers could be treated much, much worse than the Western soldiers because the Western soldiers got visits by the Red Cross. The Western soldiers had to be given a certain number of ounces per food a day. I mean, it was garbage. It was, they called it blood sausage because it was basically made from entrails, and they would scrape sawdust to make flour out of it to bake things. But the Red Cross mandated that they had to have certain ounces of food. That wasn't true on the Soviet side. Also, you couldn't work American officers, and you could only work American enlisted men a certain amount of time. You could work the Soviet officers and the Soviet men basically till they dropped because, again, not signatories to the Geneva Conventions, and they were on two sides of the camp. And this Soviet man who came up to Charles Kuralt had been a dentist, and because he was a dentist, he was allowed to travel to both sides of the camp to do dental work on the American side. And so he was passing messages back and forth, and they were smuggling food back and forth. And he was talking about how one day they knew somebody was smuggling food, so they brought out all of the American soldiers and lined them up in the hot sun and said, you're going to stand here until one of you tells me who is the person who is smuggling food from the Soviet side. And this, and actually in the book there's a link to this video because it's incredibly moving. And so this elderly man, he's sobbing and he's saying, and not a single one of them broke. They stood out there for multiple days in the hot sun. People started dropping, people started fainting, but not a single soldier gave up his name. And he said, and I have the list of the names of the American soldiers who I worked with. And he said to Charles Kuralt, will you go to America and will you find them? And Charles Kuralt was able to track down some of the men, the Americans, that he had worked with when they were helping him to smuggle food over to the Soviet side of the camp.
Wow, that is incredible. So where can we find that?
It's on YouTube because it was part of Decades, but the actual link is in the book. My book, it was published by a publisher named History Through Fiction, where their entire purpose is to tell historical stories through a fictional lens, and one of the things that they have is there is a extensive bibliography at the end of the book where I have links to the propaganda movie, where I have links to the documentaries, and where I have links to this Charles Kuralt piece, because as I said, watching that, this comes back to my question. I very blithely said I made things up, but the fact is I took pieces of various stories. I'm a big believer in first-hand sources. Because, now we're back to our other good friend of the Jews, Joseph Stalin. This quote has been attributed to him. It's been attributed to Hitler. It's been attributed to Eichmann. One death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic. And from a writing perspective, I feel that when you try to tell everybody's story, you're telling nobody's story. But when you tell one person's story, you're telling everybody's story. So I really like to read, and that actually ties into your book too. You tell a lot of individual stories to form a big picture, and that's what I do as well. Rather than just saying, I think the Soviet Union lost 11 million men. They lost more than anybody else. I could say they lost 11 million men, but that's not the same as taking you inside a prison camp and showing you details of what they ate and how they had to work and all of that.
It's incredibly moving. Just going back to that scene, and I remember the doctor also appearing in your novel as well. But also, if you think of just the idea of like a dentist at a prison camp, like none of the Novocaine stuff. I mean, yeah.
Well, I mean, a lot of people who here had dental work done in the Soviet Union will tell you there was no Novocaine anyway.
Oh, that's right. I do remember when we were immigrating, actually. Yeah, my father told me we have friends that told us to fix our teeth because in America fixing your tooth is like costs as much as a refrigerator. So, and I think like one of my relatives went and they had their like 4 or 5 teeth pulled, like my grandma or my grandpa, because they were bad, just to make sure they don't have to pay the life savings in America to do that.
Well, I had my adenoids taken out without anesthesia, so that was fun. My mother
without anesthesia?
Without anesthesia. My mother said you could hear me screaming down the block.
Oh my goodness, I had mine with anesthesia.
Well, you were from Leningrad. Maybe that was different there.
I don't know. I wouldn't say we're very advanced in Leningrad. I think somebody gave
There was bribes involved?
Vodka was involved to make sure I had a good doctor. So I think vodka buys you some anesthesia, but there was a lot of fainting and a lot of other procedures which we will not go into, but I'm curious to know more later about that. But yeah, so I highly recommend this book. It's just so visual. And it just speaks to, I think, to your skill in incorporating the secondhand research and historical research, and also considering the fact that when we talk about these stories of, you have forced relocation of ethnic Koreans by Stalin. I think
they actually were relocated in the 1930s because Stalin knew World War II. Well, he didn't have that name yet, but he knew war was coming, and he was convinced that the Koreans living on the Soviet side would be a fifth column for the Japanese. He was convinced they were all men, women, 2-year-olds were spies for the Japanese. So he packed them all up. 2-year-olds. So he packed them all up and he sent them to Siberia. They were in Siberia. He sent them to the north. He sent them to Siberia. You think of when you think of Siberia, the more northern section.
So and they, from what I understand, they weren't even able to talk about. They tried to assimilate to where they were dropped, whether it's there or Central Asia, and not discuss it. And same as a lot of people who were in the prison camps. Like I think maybe if those of you in the audience who grew up in the Soviet Union, you had relatives that were in a prison camp. Maybe they never talked about it. In my case, the person never talked about it because it was just so traumatic. So digging those stories up and telling them or like amplifying with those details is just really helps to preserve this heritage of a very difficult time period, but a very important one too, that that we can reference even today to a lot of political situations in the world and hopefully try to avoid them somehow.
Well, let me actually turn that to your book again, in that how important is retaining a language to keeping memories alive?
Oh, wow. I wish I could, I think there are some people think, oh, I dream in this language, I dream in that language. I don't know how to, I think for me personally, it's both. But memory, I mean, what is memory, right? It's composed of, I don't know, people that we know, our childhood vivid memories when people, for example, with Alzheimer's, they remember when, their youth very vividly, but not necessarily the things that they've gone through when they're adults and then their older years. So that's something that's incredibly important to people, and it just really is just such a formative experience. We form our personalities, our preferences, all of our first experiences happen when we're young, and relationships with our family members, even distant ones, and jokes and books and songs, and I think it's all just so important. And you can't always understand it if it has to be translated. I mean, you can translate it.
You said that you wanted your children to be able to speak to your parents, and that was actually because I have no particular great love of the Russian language. It's like people tell me, oh, I love that Anna Karenina age. I wish that I had lived there, and I'm like, well, I pretty much knew where I would be at the time of Anna Karenina, so no, I don't wish I lived there.
Yeah, but we'd probably be somewhere very close.
We'd be
pushing
together,
some kind of a cart.
Yeah, we would not be riding. We would not be riding in a troika in a firm off, going, "Oh, isn't this a wonderful time to be alive?" So
actually, we would not be riding at all because we probably wouldn't know how to ride because we were not allowed in the yeshiva.
Correct. So basically you and I not going back in time.
No.
But my point is that, when it came to me, why it was important for my children to learn Russian is not out of any love of Pushkin or Anna Karenina, although I did really want my children to be able to watch Bremenski Muzikante, which was kind of my favorite thing. Thank you. And yeah, even my non-Russian speaking husband, we played it so many times that he knows, oh yeah, the Genialny Sishik. So that was really important to me, that they'd be able to watch some of that and be able to understand some of the songs. But really, the most important reason for me, for my kids that I failed but tried, is so they could speak to my parents. And you had mentioned that as well, and that's why I'm bringing it around to, because yes, my parents do tell my kids stories sometimes, but if I have to translate, does that make a difference? That's what I'm asking you. How important is that piece of language and passing on family history, much less broader history?
The translation is not the same. And actually, saw that video yesterday. That's so funny. The Bremenski Muzikante, they asked for it. Even though there's not a lot of talking there, it's like, is it really helping you to acquire the second language? You know what the heck, just watch it. The songs are nice. And it's just a really great story. I think for me, it was not even something that I just actually chose consciously. I felt like I just couldn't speak any other language to them. It just felt inauthentic and fake. And I'm not this great lover of the Russian language. I just grew up with it, and it just became a big part of who I am, whether I like it or not. In fact, when I immigrated, I was kind of at that cusp where people either completely, they adapt to the new culture, or maybe sometimes they kind of have more of the old, or it's a balance of the two. In my case, I tried to just pretend that I wasn't even an immigrant, that I didn't speak Russian, that I had no accent, which is hard because I kind of do have an accent, so try that. But at least it was not as bad as when I moved, because I had a Russian-British accent. So nobody even understood me when I spoke. Not that I spoke much. But it was a transformative period when I realized that it actually mattered to me when I first left home. And I started living with roommates and going to school, and I realized that I really missed, the blackcurrant tea and the kolbasa, oddly, you don't know what it's made of, and the songs and the movies, and I started gravitating towards a lot from that culture that I used to repudiate in my youth. And it was, you hear a lot of people say, oh, bilingualism is so important for the brain, but it's not just that. For immigrants, it's something deeper. It's a heritage, and it's a very personal thing that we can't always define, but it's very important.
We have a few more minutes, and so we were told to ask if there's any questions from the audience. So please, does anyone have questions? Yes, ma'am.
It is not related to the... Is it you who will talk about Birobidzhan and Jewish Library?
Yes, yes. This Sunday, I will talk about Birobidzhan at the Jewish Library.
I hope you can all make it. It's going to be, it's specifically on that. It's a great talk.
And one thing, Birobidzhan Republic, it wasn't independent republic. It was, how it says?
Autonomous. Yes, JAR, the Jewish Autonomous.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. People use the word interchangeably, but, well, let's put it this way. Was anyone really independent in the Soviet Union? Was anyone really autonomous in the Soviet Union?
I remember when my daughter was a teenager, she was in a Russian camp in the Crimea in attack. And she met the girl from Birobidzhan, and she told her, we don't have Jews here. We don't have Jews here, but there are lots of Russians were there. And she sent her presents, they were friends, but they just had letters to each other. But do you remember it was a movie in 30s?
Seekers of Happiness.
Yes.
There is a link to it in the bibliography. We just watched, my mother and I watched it together. We laughed at probably not the parts you're supposed to laugh. And it's all on YouTube.
And a nice and very sad movie, because we understood. That time we understood it, and now I understand it's not true, absolutely not true.
Well, as I said, they showed you beautiful. We just watched it the other night with my mother and my aunt, and we were guessing they must have shot it outside of Moscow, because they had all this rolling farmland, and you couldn't have shot it in Birobidzhan because that's not what the land looked like. And as I said, they have so many problems with insects that they were constantly burning fire, so everything was covered in a black fog. But yes. It was very much a propaganda. That's the one where the fish were so happy that they were jumping into the net. They were so happy to be there.
That's why I can't agree with you when you talk it's the first independent state.
Well, it's the name.
Don't say this, please, because it's not real. Jewish independent state.
You're absolutely right. That's part of the joke.
Yeah, you're right.
Do we have any more questions? Hi, Alex.
Hi. Two quick. How old were you when you came here?
I was 13 and a half.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
that half
now,
matters at that age.
now I hear a very slight accent. I do, but when I first got here and you were talking, I would not have guessed that you came here in your early teens. You came here at 6. I came here at 8. Little accent. I figured you were about the same age.
I actually don't hear any accent when you speak. I used to teach English at a university, actually, here at the academy of our university, and also on the East Coast. And one of the things I really did not want to happen is for people not to take me seriously. Because when I was in graduate school and I tried to teach at a private school, also actually in New York, they asked me, what are you studying? And I said, comparative literature. And they said, what languages? I said, Russian, because I'm a native speaker. And they said, well, why don't you just teach Russian? Why are you applying to teach English here to our children? And they didn't want to speak to me anymore. So I was always very self-conscious about my accent. And at one point, especially when I was teaching, even though I taught ESL and native speakers as well, obviously. So not just grammar, but composition too. And when I was interviewing for a job here, the department chair was last name of McDonald. McDonald. So obviously he's Scottish, and he's like, do I detect a slight accent? And I didn't think about his last name. I was like, yeah, I have a bit of an accent. Well, I lived in New York, and then I also studied abroad in Scotland, so maybe that's a Scottish accent you're hearing. And this McDonald guy tells me, I'm not going to say the word, he's like, bull blank, and looks at me straight in the face. I'm like, well, maybe it's not. So I still got the job, though.
All right. Part 2. Not really a question. You have a old and broad history with translating Russian into English.
Oh yes,
I
Alex.
think you should
Okay,
mention it.
let's see who remembers. So many years ago in the 1980s, there was a Russian language radio station that translated American television programming from English into Russian, and Alex and
Simulcast.
Alex and I went to high school together, so he knows that sometimes I would translate American television simultaneously. And I think the joke is at the UN, if you do simultaneous translation, which they do, you have to have 20 minutes of work and 20 minutes off because it's considered so mentally stressful. We did 3 hours straight because we didn't know you were supposed to take breaks after 20 minutes. We just did it. But yes, I don't know if anybody remembers that you had to get you had to lease a transmitter, and you would put it on top of your TV, and you would turn on the TV, and you would watch the American TV show with the volume off, and you'd have simultaneous translation in Russian.
And that was you speaking, both of you.
Well, I mean, Alex knew about it. As I said, we went to high school together.
That's amazing.
I had a grandma who sat there and listened to it.
Oh yeah. By that time, I think they had Russian language TV from New York.
Yeah, by the time
the commercials.
but there was nothing like that. This is 83 to 87 or so. I'm asking my mother. Is that about right? Late 80s, mid 80s? Yeah.
When I left for college, it was
which would have been 87. So yeah.
And my favorite thing was Anapисala pro vista.
Anapисala I comanda A.
Comanda, Team A.
18.
Oh, 18.
No, you're too young.
Yeah.
And Dallas and Dynasty, you could get all of that.
Oh yeah, I remember. We actually had that. Dallas, we were able to access that in the Soviet Union too. I remember watching it.
Ooh, yeah, that was towards the end there, not in the early.
Towards the end, that and I can't. It was a Brazilian shows are really huge. Bagate тоже плачет. I don't know. The rich people cry too.
Crying rich people. Yeah. All right. So we were asked to finish by 8:15, and I don't want to keep people too late. Does anybody have any other questions? Otherwise, everyone, please buy Masha's book. Please also buy my book.
And buy Alina's book.
There we go. This is a thing. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We really, really appreciate it. And there's wine. That's how better to end a conversation with. There's wine over there.
Thank you.
Thank you.